This is Troy Hopkins, the Director of Undergrad Career Counseling, here for our Recruiters Get Real series. With us today we've got Zoe Sullivan, Director of Consultant Engagement with Talent Path. And she's going to talk about behavioral interviews and just some tips to get you started and get you better at them, because they can be very, very difficult. So Zoe, with that, please take it away.
Yes, happy to. I'll take you through a little bit of my background and how I came to know about Talent Path, what my role is there and what it all entails, and then a little bit about how we interview folks and just some tips and tricks to make sure that you are performing at your best in the interview stage of any job search or internships that you embark on, which I'm sure you're all thinking about right now, right? So a little bit about me. I have worked at Talent Path for a little over a year now. Prior to this role, I was actually working in higher education at Rice University and a couple schools out in California in the Career Services Center. So very similar to what Troy and his team do now. And in that role, I was a career counselor and just helping people brand themselves and really excel at those interviews and resumes and all that good stuff, just to make sure that you shine. So that's a little bit about my background. At Talent Path, I have the awesome job of being a director of consultant engagement. So that means that I oversee our consultants' experience from start to finish. Also overseeing our university partnerships and how we engage with universities to make sure that we're giving back to students that are interested in going into technology, as well as supporting our consultants when they're in their journey with us. So it's really my team that provides a lot of the interview coaching that we do in training. We set the consultants up on interviews with the client companies that we're engaging with. And then once the consultants are placed in their client company placement, we actually support the consultants along their journey in that stage of the process as well. So to give some context to that, Talent Path is a little bit of a different company than if you were just going to work for, Microsoft or Apple. What's awesome about Talent Path is it's born out of a staffing company, but really it's more of a consulting technology company where we actually hire full-time consultants that are hired right from the start. They're going to be paid a full-time salary. And then once we get them through training, so you would go through like a 10 to 12 week training. Again, you're paid the whole time, but you're literally just getting trained on in-demand technologies for either the data analytics or the software engineering track. So once that's completed, then we set you up with interviews at client companies on the outset and make sure that you are good to go with your placement. You do that for a year or two, just depending on what happens with you and your journey. And then from there, hopefully you get converted by that company. So that's really our business model and how we roll. But really exciting stuff. It's a pretty new industry called job tech. So if you're interested in reading more about that, you can look up that topic and learn more about it. So obviously we deal a lot with interviews. Not only do we interview candidates by the hundreds in the sourcing and recruiting aspect of our company, but we also help our consultants that we end up actually hiring get a job with other companies, right? So we're very familiar with interviewing. We have a lot of models that we use to help train our consultants in interviewing in a strategic way. So I'm happy to share some of that with you today. I'm happy to go into those questions if you want, Troy. Happy to do that.
Yeah, let's start with the first one. How much detail should I provide for each section of the STAR pattern of a behavioral interview question, and where should I be the most detailed?
Yeah. So that's such a great question. And I think what happens a lot of times is when we get nervous, we start off with our answer and we go straight into the details of the S, which is the situation part of your answer. And it's almost like detail overload. And what ends up happening is you spend so much time on the situation and trying to paint the picture, probably because you're also trying to figure out what else to say, that you kind of run out of time and then everything is jammed into the end, right? And so we've just spent the most time with an interviewer on the situation part, which honestly is probably the least piece of interest to your interviewer. So I would say in general, your action should be the longest part of your answer. So situation, task, action, result, right? That's a typical interview answer strategy that you can use. Your action should really be the longest. Your situation and your task, keep it high level, keep it concise, because you don't want to lose your audience, right? You got to keep things concise, keep it moving, keep it flowing. The action is what they're going to care about the most, because that's what you did to solve whatever problem it was, right? Or to contribute. And to add on to that, I think a lot of times people default to saying we. So, this happened, we did this, we did that, we did that. And, that's great that you're a part of a team, but you really need to isolate what your contribution was and say, yeah, well, we decided that we needed to, build a Trello board to organize our project management. And this was what I specifically implemented. I implemented this data tracking mechanism, blah, 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 right? So having that contribution really isolated in your action, I can't tell you how many times I've told people that while I'm interviewing them. So that's a little bit of a different approach. Like, we're very developmental in our interview strategies. We're trying to see potential in you and pull out, can you take coaching in the moment and apply it right then and there? Now, a lot of interviewers won't do that for you. They'll just kind of let you fail. So, keep that in mind. Like, you need to practice this kind of stuff out loud so that you're ready to go. But we will try to provide coaching in the moment just to make sure that you're, giving it your best and seeing how you apply that coaching. So definitely action longest. Don't forget the result. Again, it can just be very high level, but it should be a positive result that's directly related to your action, right? So get that result in there. Don't forget it. Again, a lot of things I've said to people when I interview them is, what was the result? And what was the positive outcome? So definitely don't miss that part.
So that brings me to the next question that we get a lot. How long should my behavioral answers be?
Yeah, definitely. I would aim for 1.5 to 2 minutes. And that might sound really quick. But again, what you can do is record yourself giving your answer and do that multiple times until you get it down to that time length. The reason is that you start to lose your listener if you go longer than, the 2.5, 3 minute mark. Now we're getting really long-winded, right? So in order to not lose your listener, keep it concise to that time period, because that's actually when a listener's attention span is really, firing on all cylinders. So definitely keep it to that length.
And how many examples do you recommend that we prepare and practice for our interviews?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I remember I used to get this a lot when I was coaching people with interviewing stories. You can't possibly prepare a story for every question that exists known to man in interviewing. That's impossible, right? So instead of thinking about, okay, I need to prepare an answer for every single question in the world, what I would suggest that you do is look up the most common questions that are asked with this type of role that you're interviewing for, right? So I think no matter what the role is, if it's technical or if it's a customer service role or if it's a marketing role, no matter what, there are questions across the board that you are more than likely going to be asked. One of them is, tell me about yourself. Another one is, why this job? Another one is, why should we hire you? Overcoming a challenge, conflict with a teammate. Those are basically boilerplate types of questions that no matter what the role is, you may be asked that question, or it's most likely you will be asked some version of that question, right? So there's major categories of questions that you typically will be asked. So I would encourage you to identify what those are. And that way you can craft stories around those categories versus just trying to prepare for every question under the sun, which is not possible. So if I had to break it up, I would say that two major categories of questions are branding and behavioral when you're talking about overall behavioral interview, right? So branding questions are things like, tell me about yourself, right? It's a story about yourself. Why do you want this job? You're going to be asked that. And I would definitely have a good answer for how your interest in undergrad subjects, projects, different, teachers that you've been involved with. How does that all relate to your interest of this job? And you've got to paint the picture for your listener, right? So those are those branding questions, is aligning the brand of you to the brand of the job. Other branding questions include the strengths and weaknesses question. So what are strengths? What are your weaknesses? Some of these are old school, but again, they're still utilized today. So we have to know how to answer them because you never know how they're going to interview you. Short and long-term goals is another branding question. And then also what questions that you have at the end. That's another way that you can show your brand at the end, is by saying, well, I'm wondering about this, or, how is success measured in this role, right? So that tells me, okay, they're A, interested in the role, and they're B, interested in how they can be successful, right? So those are your branding questions. And then some behavioral questions that at least I typically see on the technology side are, tell me about a time you overcame a challenge, conflict with a teammate, right? That's a big one. Used innovation to solve a problem, a time that you failed, your greatest accomplishment, and a time that you persuaded someone. So those were 6 branding questions, 6 behavioral questions that I see the most. And, this is geared a little bit more towards technology, since we do hire, data analysts and full stack engineers. So there might be slightly different ones depending on the subject of interest for you, but those are the ones that I would suggest that you get ready for.
Great. And what can I use for examples of my experience if I have not done an internship before?
Yeah, great question. And you absolutely have some experience somewhere, even if you didn't do a formal internship, right? So it's all about pulling that out for your reader, if it's on your resume, and for your listener, if you're interviewing. So what I would do to find examples, if you have not had an internship, is look at your course projects, look at the class projects that you've completed, and turn those things into actionable bullet points on your resume, and turn them into stories that you can tell in your interview. So class projects, that's a big one. You could even have a section of your resume that's dedicated to class projects. That can work. And then I would also say, if you have volunteer work that you've done in the past, that can definitely count as well. And even if this is especially for technology, we see a lot of folks that apply to us and we actually look for this. So yes, internships are great, but another thing that can be a stand-in for experience, and especially if you're interested in technology, is if you have your own website, or if you have a repository of projects that you've done. So a lot of our software developers have GitHub accounts. So that's one thing I would encourage you to look at if you're interested in software engineering. So a GitHub account basically allows you to host different coding projects that you've done, so that people can see the coding that you've created, right? So that's another one that I see a lot on resumes now. And then if you're interested in data analytics, you can absolutely learn how to create your own dashboards and do some of that online. And you can host those projects on a website or a free hosting site and include that on your resume too. So that can either be listed as a link, or you could even put it as a project section where you name the project. So this is the name of the project, and then add some bullet points underneath that describe your process for putting that project together, right? So researched amount of water used across Houston from the years of 2008 to 2012, developed this dashboard based on et cetera, analytics tools, and so on. So you can absolutely highlight your experience, even if it wasn't a formal internship that you were paid for.
So one of the things that we see a lot when we're doing practice interviews, especially with students that are a little bit newer in their academic career, is that they'll kind of lean on the same project or position for multiple answers in an interview. Mm-hmm. How bad is that? And I guess the question really would be, how many can I get away with using the same project before it starts to become a problem?
Yeah, a great question. And I think it's definitely easy to lean on one specific story, especially if it was really kind of your standout story and it's just so filled with great nuggets in there. But I would say, try not to do that as best you can. Because what happens is your listener is taking that as, okay, lack of experience, right? And even though you're applying for likely an internship or entry-level role, you still to some degree have to emulate that you're bringing experience to the table, that you're bringing expertise, right? So don't undersell yourself by just having this one example that you're kind of leaning on going back to. I would say if you end up in this situation, the most that you could use for one story would probably be 2 questions. If you're going down now a third question that you've been asked and you're using the same story again, that's A, you're losing your listener because they already heard the story. And then B, you're signaling, lack of experience, which again, you still want to bring that expertise, right? You still want to kind of bring your confidence and your expertise to this role and prove that, you are a great match for this role. So I would say 2 maximum examples from the same story. And if you can, highlight different aspects or even different time periods of that project between those 2 answers. So, try not to retell that same story that you just did, but if you're retelling that same story, quickly just say, yeah, and the same, with the same project, this happened. And, the answer to your question is this, right? And so you would really just highlight that different aspect of that story versus retelling the whole thing over again. A good question.
And then what if I realize that I'm not giving a great answer halfway through my answer? Can I stop and start over again? And if I do, what should I say?
Yeah. So I think this may depend on your interviewer too. Some are harsher than others. But I would say that that's okay. It's obviously not, the best, but hey, things happen. Sometimes you lose your train of thought or you're going down a rabbit hole that you weren't thinking that you're going to go down. So I think it definitely has happened before. And it's honestly fine if in the middle of it, you say, oh, you know what, excuse me, I actually think I have an example that would better fit your answer, if that's okay, if I can use that one. And so I would check with your interviewer and say, is it all right if I actually tell you another story? I think that this one, maybe better aligned to what you're asking. I think that's fine because you're showing respect to your interviewer. You're asking them, for permission to retell this story in a different story. So I would say that that's totally fine to do. And again, don't let you get stuck. Don't let that trip up your mind and your thinking, because it's definitely a slippery slope. Once you start feeling nervous, you're going to then devolve into, the nervous version of yourself. And that doesn't serve you at all, so forgive yourself, move on, ask to use a new answer. And I honestly think that that's fine to do. And it does happen sometimes. And it's happened with people that I've interviewed, and I think it's fine. So yeah.
How do I answer a behavioral question that I do not have a good example for?
Yeah, this is another great question. And again, it can happen. There are so many questions that an interviewer can ask you, and you cannot be prepared for everything under the sun. So again, if you try the strategy of understanding the role that you're applying to and that you are interviewing for, if you really understand that role, you should be able to, for the most part, prepare for the questions that they're going to ask you, because they're going to ask you about the role. They're going to ask you about, company culture and questions that are around that for how you fit into that. And so if you do a lot of research on the front end and understand that, then that's going to set you up for success. Now, things happen, right? They can ask you something totally out of left field, like, what's your favorite animal? Or if you had to choose between blue and purple socks, what would you choose, right? So there's a lot of strange questions that can be asked. But the way to get through that is try to find the intention of the question, right? So every question has an intention. If I ask you, tell me about a time you had a conflict with a coworker, I'm trying to understand, how do you manage different personalities in the workplace in an effective way so that you still maintain relationships, right? That's what that question means. And so if you have an example of a time where, okay, it wasn't a conflict, but, we misunderstood each other. That counts, by the way. And use that example because it's best aligned to the intention of the question. Part of this also is how you think on your feet. So I would say before you're even starting to interview with companies, do a lot of practice of thinking on your feet. I used to have this conversation a lot with students that are on the more introverted side, and listen, love introverts, and there's nothing, wrong with being an introvert. But I've noticed that introverts sometimes struggle with the thinking on their feet in interviews. The only reason for that is that extroverts, they have more practice talking. They have more practice thinking on their feet and, doing this and that, because it's usually a part of who they are, right? They're automatically doing these things. And so again, love introverts, we need them in the workplace. So many strengths there. But to be able to shine in an interview, you might need to spend a little bit more time just practicing thinking on your feet, so that you can be creative and have good answers to the questions that you're being asked. So improv classes, I would recommend. Toastmasters is a good one too. Anything that puts you into a situation where you have to think quickly on your feet and come up with creative ideas on the fly is going to be beneficial for you. And not only for interviews, but also for your entire career. I mean, thinking on your feet is definitely key. So that's what I would say is the advice that I would give there.
Perfect. So one of our students had a question, so I'll share it here.
Awesome.
Is it important that the experiences we quote be recent ones? Because during the interview, I tend to quote the one that comes to my mind at that point, especially for the questions I have not rehearsed or prepared an answer for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I'll give both sides of it. I think the more recent that the experience was, in the eyes of the interviewer, the better, because then they can extrapolate that the behavior you exhibited at that time will most likely match your behavior now, right? Now, I think there's also exceptions. If you have a really good example that is most aligned to that question, and let's say it was from 4 or 5 years ago, I think that's okay, right? So as long as you frame it that way and say, oh, actually, I have a great answer for this question, and this happened at this position 5 years ago, is it okay if I tell that story, right? So that's how I would attack that one. And I think it's fine to use those. Again, if you can focus most of your answers on the more recent years, that's probably the best. But sometimes you can go back to that older experience as well once in a while.
So I know that the folks in my office have had this happen to them, and I was telling Zoe before we started that I've actually overheard it during real interviews. So I know it happens, unfortunately, but when a student goes completely blank and they make up a story, can you tell that they're doing that?
Yes, definitely. And I would really be careful here. And I know it's easy to get caught up in, the nervousness and what your mind is doing, which again is why I would encourage you to do things like improv, Toastmasters, practicing talking on the spot, and then also practice some mindfulness too, because if you can anchor yourself to the present moment, you're just going to be a little bit more in tune with your body and your answers and how they're coming out versus being in this like nervous state where now you're rattling off a story that's not even true, right? Because you just feel like you need to fill the space and answer the question. So yes, we can usually tell if the answer is not 100% true. And I would be, again, very careful with those kinds of answers because there are definitely interviewers out there who will allow you to quote unquote hang yourself on the answer. So they will, let you talk and into the flurry of the untruths, and then they'll maybe even pick at those answers until it's very obvious that this answer is not true, right? So I definitely would be very careful there. I would not encourage you to lie at all. And speaking of lying and interviewing, I feel like there is this notion out there that if you are interviewing, that of course you're gonna lie, or if you are trying to tell a great story about yourself, it feels like lying. So I would say don't allow your insecurity about what it is you're bringing to the table convince you that you're not telling the truth and that you need to be more humble, or that you need to, not say things a certain way or talk about it in we. Highlight what your accomplishment was. They're interviewing you as a singular person. They're not interviewing your team. You're not lying if you are just saying how excited you are about this role and here are the strengths that you're bringing to the table. I think that's something that I would hear a lot in interview coaching and even resume writing is, you have a lot you're bringing to the table, and the way you say it can be more convincing or it can be less convincing, right? So that in no way is lying. It's just being confident about what you're bringing to the table.
And I'll just add a bit about that. We try to reassure students as they're going through academics that, especially your internship or in your first time job, they're not expecting you to be a technical expert on what you're getting hired for, or you would probably be too overqualified for the role. When you look at the top skills employers are looking for, like 9 out of 10 of them are things like communication, leadership, teamwork, interpersonal, organizational stuff that's not directly related to, like, can you code? Can you build, a consulting role all from scratch or whatever. So I think your experience is better than you think it is, for sure. Okay, so for the next question, this one kind of goes after the interview, but as for thank you emails after an interview, and if you're doing that, good on you, man, because so many people are not. Is there such a thing as sending them too early or too late?
That's a great question. And it's funny, I was just listening to something the other day and it was like, don't send thank you emails, no one reads them, and You're going to hear so many different opinions on this. I would say do what you feel is the right thing to do. And I would say, hey, it's a good practice, and for certain interviewers, it can definitely help you stand out. So if it's something that takes you minimal effort and you can just do it very quickly and it may actually help your candidacy, why wouldn't you do that? So I encourage it. I think it's great. In terms of when to send it, I would send it within 24 hours of the interview, but not during weird times. So within 24 hours of the interview, but hopefully during typical work hours, like 8 to 6, right? Sometime within that window, because if you're sending thank you emails at like 2 in the morning, it's like, well, what are you doing at 2 in the morning? Why are you emailing me, right? And that again can leave a strange impression. I wouldn't personally care, but I'm just letting you know what is out there, that it can be interpreted certain ways. So I would say, again, within 24 hours and then within normal work hours.
And this one may come either in the interview process or even during the application process, but we get this question quite a bit. What's the best way to answer the dreaded question, what's your desired salary? I know that we've said open, but sometimes I've seen applications where it actually makes you put a number in there. How would you answer that?
Absolutely. And this is such a great question. And I think what we have to recognize is a lot of the systems that companies use do have that as a standard question at application, right? So there's a couple ways around it or how you want to approach it. At the very first, before you're even embarking in your search, I would do some analysis to understand what is the salary range that you're comfortable with for this role. Okay, so that's going to take some research on your end to understand, all right, if I want to be an entry-level data analyst, I need to understand, if I'm going to be getting this job in Houston and that's the geographic location that I want to live in, what's the entry level typical salary for a data analyst, right? And pull it from several different websites that you're getting more of like a triangulated view of what that average is. And then I would also look back at your own personal finances and get an idea of, okay, break down what are going to be my expenses monthly? What does that add up to in terms of annual expenses? And then what would be my salary, desired minus all those expenses? And that's, whatever you have left over. What am I comfortable with? So that's part one. Part one is figuring out What is your, what are your expenses and what do you need to cover those and feel comfortable? And then B is industry. What's the going rate? You know, what's the value out there for this kind of role and for what level of experience? And how am I bringing that level of experience to this role that I can feel confident about asking for that amount, right? So that's step one. Step two is where you might first encounter this is in the application state, right? So when you're applying for a job, you've got to fill out a bunch of stuff. And one of those is the desired, maybe your desired salary, right? Now, pay attention to the way this question is worded, because in certain systems, it says, what's your desired salary, which I think is probably the best option if it's included. Another one is, what's your past salary? I'm not big on people reporting their past salary because I think it has really no meaning for the kind of role that you're going for. And especially for an entry-level role, if you're working in an ice cream shop and you're going to be a data analyst, very different sides of the coin in terms of salary, right? So, so if it says, what's your past pay? I would try to actually not answer that question. So sometimes you can not even answer it on the application. Now, if the application says, no, you have to answer this question, I would try to put in, if you can try to put in like negotiable or, you know, would rather keep that, you know, private. You don't actually have to share that information legally. You don't have to. So that's how I would try to go about it. Now, if it's still preventing you and it's like, you have to put a numerical amount, then if you're comfortable, put in an amount that you feel, you know, again, you've gotten paid for. Again, that's like a last resort, but if you really want to apply for the job, you got to do it. So just do that. Now, the other piece is desired pay, right? So that's a more reasonable question, in my opinion. And again, you should know what that is based on your research. Now, it's better if you have this conversation with a recruiter in the actual interview, because that's when you can negotiate more. I will say, as an aside, we don't negotiate salaries for consultants because we bring in cohorts at a time. Some of your other campus recruiters do this as well. So something to be aware of. If they do cohort hiring, or if they hire a bunch at once as part of a group, they usually don't allow you to negotiate your salary because everyone's coming in at the same level, right? So that's just an FYI, but there may still be, you know, a position you're applying for that you're not negotiating, or that you're not a part of a cohort and you can negotiate for. So if you do desired salary, you can either put in, you know, some words like negotiable or, you know, open, or you can even put in a range. So, you know, 50 to 60, right? Now, if it doesn't allow you to do that, and it wants you just to put in a straight number, again, consider, am I okay with sharing this information in application? If I want to move forward, I might have to. So put in that desired number, maybe put it on the higher end, and then you can have a discussion about it with the recruiter when you're actually interviewing. So that's how I would handle that situation. Negotiation of salary is definitely something that I would encourage you to visit your career center and talk through with your career coaches, because there's definitely a finesse to it. And there's a way that you can approach it in a way that, you know, I think is reasonable and will actually help you get what you want and need. Because even though you're maybe going into an entry-level role, it doesn't hurt sometimes to ask for a salary that you feel is on par with your level of experience and talent that you're bringing to the role. So yeah, that was a really long-winded answer, but I hope it answered everything regarding salary and application, because it's definitely a tricky subject.
Yeah, it is tricky. So that was deserving of a detailed answer for sure. So we'll go back to towards the beginning of the interview process. Do you have any tips on how to answer it? Tell me about yourself.
Yes. And we do ask this question, by the way. Yeah, so I think that question, it haunts so many job seekers, right? Tell me about yourself. Where do I start? What do I say? Do I tell them about when I was a baby? Do I tell them about, you know, when I broke my leg in 4th grade? No, right? So you, again, got to think about the context that you're giving this answer and the intention behind the question, right? So the intention behind the question is this person is trying to understand, what is your story about? Where do you feel are the valuable points that you want to share with me? And also, how does that relate to your ability to do well in this role? Because the subtext of the conversation is about the role that you're interviewing for. Don't forget that, okay? Yes, you can throw in some, interesting tidbits about yourself, you're an artist, this and that, but all in all, it should be focused on why you're a good fit for this position, right? So I would start it out with your interest that relates to the role, right? So, I work in the recruiting and career management type of industry because I recognize after working in social services for a while, I really wanted to venture over to the positive side of counseling and coaching, right? That's when I started doing research on da 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 da, and that's why I chose my major in da 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 da. I had some projects that I completed that helped me build XYZ skills. Now I'm at the end of my academic career. I'm graduating next fall, and I'm really interested in working for a company that's very innovative in a role that allows me to use my focus on analytics and passion for helping people develop in their careers, right? So that's kind of how you want to end and round that out. I would even say too at the end, pull them into the present, right? So this is a good tip. That's why I'm here interviewing for this role. I saw the position for Talent Path, I applied online, and I'm really excited to talk more about what the role is like and to give you more information about my background, right? So bring them into the forefront, bring them into the current moment at the very end, but really it's just the highlights of your story, and especially as they relate to your interest and aptitude for the role at hand.
Cool. And so we'll go towards the end of the interview now. Do you have any examples of good questions interviewees have asked you before?
Yeah, so I would say one that I hear more often is, what does success look like in this role? And that's actually a great one because you can get an idea of what is it that this role is going to be measured on, what's important to this company regarding the performance of this role. And that's important for you to understand because you want to be in line with that and be able to deliver that. Another one that I heard that I think is very creative is if you could rank all of the people who have done this job, who would be number one and why? That's a pretty different one, right? But also really cool and kind of makes your interviewer think. Another one that I like that I used to coach people on to use is, outside of the job description and what you've shared about the role today, what are you really looking for in someone for this role? Like outside the job description, what would you say are the qualities of someone that goes above and beyond in this role and has done really well? The great thing about asking this question is after you get an answer from your interviewer, you can actually build onto that. So they'll say, well, yeah, on top of the job description, we look for people who are very self-aware, that are self-starters, and that are innovative, right? And so if you hear anything that resonates with you and your personal brand, take that as an opportunity to build off of that and create a conversation, right? So after they give you an answer, you can say, oh, that's awesome. I'm so glad that you talked about, self-awareness as being something important for this role, because that's something that I've consistently tried to work on. I've been taking a lot of mindfulness classes, and I've done some exercises with my career development office to help me understand my strengths. And so that's actually something that's really important to me. And I'm glad you mentioned that, right? So use it as an opportunity to build off of it. So those are the ones that stand out in my mind.
Cool. Another one we have here. How can we assess our interview skills following an interview that we personally think was well executed? Like you walk away going, nailed it. But how do you know, I guess, other than them calling back and saying, we want to, when can you start? What's a good way to assess how you did in an interview?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I would say just asking for feedback from the interviewer, which surprisingly a lot of people don't do. I've maybe had 2 people ask me for that, and I'm always willing to give it because I worked in career services before, so I just want to see people grow and develop. But definitely asking them for feedback, if it's appropriate. So whether they hire you or not is definitely a good indicator. And, I don't know how you would feel about this. You may have to run this by your interviewer too, but you may even want to record yourself or see if you can record yourself. And again, I would definitely run that by your interviewer and say, I would love to just record my own answers if that's okay for you, just so I can continue to learn about my style. I think as long as you ask them if it's okay and get permission, then that should be fine. So that's another way that you could do it too.
So in terms of, because I know you talk a lot about personal branding and I've coached folks on that too. How do you integrate your personal brand into your interview storytelling?
Definitely. So I think step one is definitely developing the self-awareness of what your personal story is, right? That's going to be key. And we do this actually as a workshop for all of our new hires of consultants, because I want them to understand that the story that you tell yourself about who you are is going to come out in any interview situation, you're networking, when you interact with clients, it's always running in the background. And so you got to figure that out first. So there's a few exercises that you can do, but there's actually questions that you can answer that will help you understand what is your story. And one of them is, if you think back to the challenges that you've overcome in your life, usually with career, we're pushed and interested into career tracks that will help us understand, overcome, and almost be experts in whatever challenges that we personally experienced as human beings. So if you understand that basic concept, you can probably think back to some of the challenges that you've overcome in your life and connect them to your career interests. Now, of course, in your interview, you don't want to go too deep into like a very sad story about your overcoming your challenge, but being aware of it will help you harness your confidence that you brought from overcoming that challenge, and you can describe your story more easily, right? So I think this most comes out in your tell me about yourself story, right? So for me, I saw my mom, who worked in the STEM industry, overcome a lot of challenges that had to do with her being one of the only women that worked in an office, right? And because of that, I'm really passionate about women and STEM and pursuing STEM, which again is kind of what brought me to Talent Path, was being able to have the chance to give people career opportunities, and mostly women and underserved populations, these career opportunities in STEM really resonated with what I had seen out there when my mom was growing up, or when she was in her career and I was growing up. So having that connection, it just kind of solidifies like, wow, this person is personally connected to this mission that we're on. So I think if you could kind of dig into that a little bit with your career advisors, or, understanding like what are the challenges that you've overcome, how do you turn that into your passion for your career and your career track, you can weave that into stories that you tell in your interviews as well. Another piece I'll say really quick is your strengths. So it's really good to understand what your strengths are, and they're inherent in who you are. They're in your DNA. There's tools that you can go through, like Strengths Quest, that are really good for giving you language to talk about your strengths. So for example, I'm ideation, so I really like ideas, and I like exploring the possibilities of things. And this tool, Strengths Quest, helped me get language to talk about that. So I would definitely encourage you to dive into your strengths, understand how to talk about those, and you can actually weave those into your stories as well, right? So if the question is, when did you use innovation to solve a problem? I can say, sure, well, I know from taking the Strengths Quest assessment that I am an ideation person. That means I'm really into ideas. I like innovating. I like exploring different solutions. And so one time that I did that in particular was X, Y, Z, right? So that's kind of how you can naturally embed that stuff into your interview answer. So that's a really good question.
Awesome. So got one final question before we open it up for the group, which will be off the recording. But as we wait to hear back after the interview, is there anything we should do that could possibly help us stand out from other candidates? I know I have ideas.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. And I would love to hear your ideas as well. So I think that thank you note can really be helpful. Don't be afraid to follow up either, because let me tell you, recruiters are so busy. And, I know it's frustrating to get interviewed and then not hear back for a while. And we try to be really good about that with Talent Path. But it's tough. We're talking to a lot of candidates, a lot of people, but don't be afraid to follow up, once, twice is okay. It's getting a little risky because, again, they're very busy, but really don't be afraid to follow up. I think that's perfectly fine. Just check in the status of my application. I'm really interested. Please let me know if there's any additional information that I can provide to you regarding my candidacy. Hope to hear from you soon, that kind of thing, right? So I think that's perfectly fine. But I'm curious, Troy, what other ideas do you have as well?
Yeah, the thank you note for me is just like,
Yeah.
it's one of those things that really has set people apart that I have interviewed and hired. I'm shocked at how rare it is. And so when I get thank you emails or thank you notes, especially like if someone's willing to put in the time to handwrite a note and give it to like when you're doing live interviews, obviously, and hand it to the reception and like, oh, would you mind putting these in people's mailboxes or whatever? That is just really special. And it sounds very corny. Thank you emails are great too, but it's so rare that people even do those, that it does make people stand out for sure. So yeah, that's the big one for me. Yeah.
No, it absolutely does. I think you're so right. And it was funny. I was talking about this with someone the other day, but a lot of job search, interviewing, networking, all of that stuff, it's actually like dating. I mean, it really is. It's the same kind of thing. You want to be courteous, you want to show interest, you want to be respectful, and there's definitely some conversations that I've had that have rubbed me the wrong way. And I'm a very open, like accepting person. But it just makes me think, like, would you say this on a date, or would you ask these kind of questions, if you're just getting to know someone? There's definitely been some no-nos. So if you're ever curious about, okay, how can I get better at this thing? Just approach it like a relationship. Approach it like you would someone that you're really trying to get to know and understand and impress. And I guarantee you, thinking about it that way will help you be more effective.
Awesome. So thank you so much for the tips today. Great to see you, and thanks for doing this session for us.
Of course. So happy to be here.